Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Shamini Pierce coming to you from Baltimore. Have you wondered how climate change might affect your food supply? Well, according to a new United Nations report on climate change, agriculture, and food, 42 million people will be vulnerable to hunger by 2050. This will be due to climate change. This figure does not include the growing numbers of people affected by extreme weather events. The report came just ahead of the UN conference in Rome last week on world food security. It's worth noting that last week, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction said the number of weather and climate-related disasters has more than doubled in the last 2 decades compared with the 2 prior decades. So how do we prepare for the future and feed 9 billion people, which is what the estimated human population will be in 2050? And what does sustainable agriculture look like to address this problem? To discuss this and what came out of the Rome conference to address food security, climate change, and how we can make agriculture more sustainable, we are joined by Kirtana Chandraeskaran. She is the Food Security Program Coordinator at Friends of the Earth International. She's also the author of the article, "We Need an Agroecological Revolution." Kirtana, so good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Kirtana, we know that agriculture and forestry and changes in land use are the greatest emitters after the energy sector. Together, they produce apparently more than 21% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So what came out of the Rome conference, which you were at, that addresses this problem?
Well, there's to first put the contribution of agriculture to climate change a bit more in perspective. The figures that were released by the FAO are, of course, the official figures that they look at. But actually, if you consider the fact that a lot of the contributions to greenhouse gas emissions from the food system are not counted under food emissions. So, for example, the fact that deforestation, which accounts for a huge number of climate emissions globally, the food sector contributes about 80% approximately of deforestation worldwide to produce kind of massive amounts of industrial commodities like biofuels and animal feed and palm oil and soya oil and these kinds of things, which is not counted under the food system. Then you also have things like transportation, and transportation is a fifth of global emissions, and food transportation is somewhere you could say a quarter of those, which again don't get counted under the food. So all in all, if you really judged it by what we would say the whole industrial food system is contributing, it could be almost half actually of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh, that's tremendous. So was the problem seen in that perspective?
Yes and no, and I'll explain that a bit. I think the meeting in Rome was a multilateral UN meeting, so of UN governments, and it's kind of, let's say, the most important, the foremost multilateral space to discuss food security and nutrition. But it has its limitations. So one of the issues that we consistently bring up at Friends of the Earth, which you can also see in the article, is the fact that you can't just club the whole food system together. Why? Well, because first of all, it's not the whole food system, it's the industrial food system that really contributes to climate emissions. Through, for example, things like deforestation, which I just brought up, the huge emissions from the use of fossil fuels for industrial agriculture, emissions from making and then applying nitrogen fertilizer in inorganic fertilizers, livestock, industrially produced livestock contributes a massive amount of emissions. So this is on one side where you see this huge contribution. On the other side, you have small-scale farming, what we call small-scale, smallholder agroecological food production, which is not really given that much importance. But actually, if you look at the figures, and the FAO has done some research on this, smallholder food production produces 70% of the world's food that is consumed today. So they are the most important food producers. And they do it with the least amount of land and the least amount of resources. So it's actually a myth that the industrial food system is feeding the world, because they're not. What they're actually doing is contributing to climate emissions. So, which is why we really push hard in these type of multilateral conversations to get the role of smallholder producers identified, and also their contribution to reducing climate emissions. So the concept of agroecology is getting a lot of attention nowadays from governments, and it's basically things like adding carbons to soil, to have integrated livestock pasture systems, things like this. It's quite simple concepts really, but it's what actually small-scale farmers in the developing world, and probably a long time ago in Europe and North America as well, have done for hundreds of years, till they are now being destroyed by the system. So what we really need is a massive return, a big kind of system change to return to this type of farming, which is what these governments need to be promoting. So they made some big steps, I would say, in doing that, but we still could do a lot more.
So give us some really practical examples of how what they discussed in Rome could have in terms of impact locally. So basically you are advocating here that the best route to go is local agriculture and sustainable farming. What does that mean?
Well, to answer your first question first, so the governments, they discussed two major issues, let's say. I mean, every year they discuss two different types of issues in this forum. It's called the Committee on World Food Security. And this year they discussed smallholders and markets. So what that actually means is what is important about how you support smallholders, basically, to have the right market conditions for them to make their agriculture more viable. And they actually came up with a very positive set of recommendations. So for one thing, they actually recognized again that in terms of food security, smallholder farmers are the most important people. And so too, that they operate in local and regional markets, which are the most important. About 80% of global markets of food are really local and regional markets, and those are the most important markets, not really the global kind of agri-food chains that you see when you shop in Walmart or Tesco or Carrefour. Those are not the most important markets. And so they first recognized these two things, which is a huge step for governments to take. And then they came up with some recommendations as to how you can actually support smallholder food producers to get good prices for what they produce, support them to actually be a part of these markets and enable these markets to grow. So this was the first set of quite good recommendations. And now what needs to be done really is for governments who are part of the World Committee on Food Security to take this back and see how they can actually work with this in the various national and domestic regulations and legal frameworks that they have. The second set of issues that they discussed was also extremely relevant to climate change, which was sustainable agriculture and livestock. And here they also had some helpful recommendations. They stopped just short of recognizing that in fact it's the industrial sector that contributes the most to emissions. But they did recognize, for example, all the different types of livestock that you could have for pastoral systems, for example, or mixed livestock farming systems, where you have nomads ranging and producing pasture-fed livestock, for example. And they came up with a set of ideas of how to make the industrial system more sustainable. So it kind of implicitly suggests that it's not sustainable.
Why are they not being so outspoken about it? You said they fell short of naming the industrial sector as the greatest polluter here. Who's around the table? Why are they so careful?
Well, the two answers are actually extremely related. The around the table are governments, but around the table is also what we call civil society. That's us and organizations like Friends of the Earth, but also actually organizations of affected people. So organizations of small-scale food producers, of indigenous peoples, of pastoralists, of women food producers, youth food producers. They all sit around the table. But we also have the private sector who sit at the table with governments. And of course, talk to governments behind the scenes. And I mean, there are huge financial interests in livestock production, as we know. So there are several countries, not just private sector companies, but also countries that are very reluctant to have the importance of their livestock production taken away. So what they would prefer to do is to what we call greenwash, which is to keep the system essentially the same, but make a few tweaks here and there. So you could, for example, try to make feed production more efficient. So then you would say, okay, I'm not causing 10 hectares of deforestation for every kilo, but a few less. So the system goes on with a few tweaks, but that's not enough, as we know. If we want really to address climate change, it needs to be here and now. So we need kind of a wholesale change of the system.
And as you say, we need a systems change because climate change is already upon us, and with increasing frequency and severity, particularly when you factor in extreme weather. We already have millions of people who have gone, 60 million actually, have already found hunger facing them, especially in Southern Africa, and because of food shortages this year. And they, of course, cite El Nino effect and climate change as the reason for this kind of hunger. In Southern Africa, did that problem come up? Did they discuss the severity and the urgency of the problem?
They do discuss the severity of the problem. I think it's difficult to ignore it. But I think it's also important to remember that for decades now, we have had roundabout every year about 800 million people in the world classified as hungry or malnourished. So there's a lot of people, even without climate change, who are going hungry. A lot of these people are, again, affected by the industrial food system and don't have access to food, and they're unable to buy food. So climate change is just going to make it worse. So we're already starting with huge numbers, and we're going to add more on top of those numbers. And again, if you look at the justice element of this issue, it's that climate change is going to affect developing countries, so sub-Saharan Africa, also large parts of Asia, where there are huge populations of people, but also populations of people who have contributed the least to climate change are going to be the most affected in their food supplies, while mostly, on the whole, Europe and North America will not be affected so badly. So I think people recognize that there's going to be a huge problem. We need really governments to be a lot more courageous to take the steps that we need. And some of them are. We really need to stop tweaking the industrial system around the edges. But really, if we want agroecology and sustainable farming to take off in the way that we need it to take off, it actually needs a huge amount of government support. And not just financial support, it could do with financial support. So, I think it's like 2 million around about, something like that, 22 to 20 million gets spent on research on sustainable farming, while we have billions and billions spent on other types of industrial farming research. But they could also do other types of public policy support. We have some fantastic examples of that have happened. For example, in Brazil, their national program to support family farming, which has several elements of discussing with smallholder farmers what their needs and wants are, then having farmer-to-farmer exchanges for knowledge sharing, and then putting in place, for example, public procurement. So they have a massive public procurement policy to source from small-scale family farms and agroecological production. And it's had a huge impact on Brazil's ability to produce sustainable food. The same happened in Cuba, for example, where they have had to, out of circumstances, farm in a much more sustainable way because they didn't have access to the kind of fossil fuels and fertilizers, etc., available in the global market. And they actually increased their food production almost 30% year on year over the last decade. And that's huge. And they've done it exactly in an agroecological way. So we have these examples. We just need governments to recognize it and get rid of the vested interests that don't want it.
All right, Kirtana, I thank you so much for giving us this window into the problem and how we may solve it. We would love to have you back to continue talking about potential solutions to this problem. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.